many American children are getting shabby educations. They don't make it through to high school graduation, often. When they do, for some reason, they must along the way have forgotten their literacy and math skills because these are below 12th grade level, often by a lot. And this is especially true among poorer segments of society. Of those with lower income, Professor Lerner spoke about, of those who are in single-parent households. And again, we could go through the usual characterization of who is involved. Now, can this really be blamed on the state? Of course it can. Of course it can. We do a pretty terrible job of public education at the primary level in America. Every international survey seems to show that. And what's remarkable, and this really is remarkable, is that although in all these league tables, we're laggards. Probably not for many of you where you went to school, because schools are tied to residential place, and those who live in nice cushy neighborhoods in suburban, I can't even remember your suburbs here. Some are in Maryland, some in Fairfax, tend to do pretty well. But when people are tied to certain schools that significantly fail, and the story of the failure of Washington schools was told almost like a Greek tragedy in the period of pre-superintendent Reed, and then how many years was she here total? 3 years, and we're seeing, Achilles at the gates, and then out again, and so on. I would say that American education not only reflects, but produces an invidious equality. We should do better. How do I know we can do better? Because when you turn from primary education to America's college and university system, what you find is that we are by a big gap world leaders. And in all sorts of ways that's reflected. It's reflected in surveys in which say 27 out of 30 top worldwide research universities are located here. The one that I find most compelling is how many kids from all over the world want to come here to get an American college degree. I don't think they come here to go to a DC public school, not willingly. We could talk more about, what the causes are of this, what could be done about it. I told you before that I tend to be pretty libertarian, so you're going to guess that my ideas would involve breaking up the public school monopoly. In my heart of hearts, in a very radical way, unfortunately in the next session, it talks about great economic thinkers. They've left out my favorite of the 20th century, and that's Milton Friedman, whose ideas on American education and what could be done to improve it, at least at the margin, I find compelling. But let me move on to a third kind of inequality that I find dangerous for us, and it's growing more dangerous. But here my thunder has been taken by Professor Lerner when he talked about healthcare. Because again, we lead the world in the amount of money that's spent on individuals' health maintenance in this country. We have a flagrantly inefficient healthcare system. There's a lot of debate. Some say, yes, we're still the best in the world. Others look at different statistics and say, no. I don't think anybody could suppose, though, that the quality we get per dollar represents genuine efficiency. Well, what does this have to do? What does this have to do with equality? Actually, Americans tend to be more equal in terms of the healthcare services they receive than in a whole lot of other things. Things like housing, things like transportation budgets and such. The difficulty is that for many, they get this in the ridiculously inefficient way, showing up in emergency rooms and so on, often later than they should. In fact, if you're somebody who makes $20,000 a year versus somebody who makes $200,000 a year, the cost of removing a diseased appendix is roughly the same for each of you. It's roughly the same in expected healthcare costs at these different incomes, and so in terms of insurance cost coverage. So let's suppose that the $20,000 person, the $200,000 person, it's a good year. Each is going to get 5% more from their employer the next year. Suppose healthcare costs go up just $1,000 a year. Well, what that means is the lower paid person, that's entirely eaten up by the healthcare cost. It will be in what's called a fringe benefit rather than cash payment, but it's still paid for. Whereas for the higher earning person, that leaves still, if I'm doing my math right, $9,000 greater in salary, in cash salary. This explains to a large extent why, and I apologize for trying to sound like an economist. Obviously, I can't pull it off. But this is why, if you look at median income tables and things like that of income, right, you will find it essentially flat toward the middle, much greater, whereas the upper quintile and, of course, the upper 1% growing a lot. A lot of this has to do with our misplaced healthcare system. Will Obamacare improve things? You know, I hang out with people who think this is the end of freedom in America. They tend to get pretty apocalyptic about it. Others who say, it's about time. We notice the 50 million people without health care insurance and such. I'm going to be agnostic on this. I don't think that the Obama plan is very good, but I don't think our current system is very good. I think it's terrible, and it promotes the kind of inequality that I find objectionable. How much time do I have left?
Minus.
You're a little bit over.
All right, give me 2 minutes. I was hoping I'd run out of time because I didn't really want
your colleagues to you.
I didn't really want to go into this. I'm going to say that there's nobody under 30 in this room, and if you are, pretend otherwise, because a really invidious kind of inequality that is great in this country and has been growing is unequal treatment of the young versus the old. The amount of subsidization that's taken from young people in various, obviously, taxes and the stuff that goes to the old through Social Security, through Medicare, through and things that aren't quite as obvious, like the kind of pensions that states and the federal government are paying. I found this to be pretty outrageous. And it amazes me that when I come in here and you guys look at me and you say, yeah, he's one of them. He looks like a Medicare recipient sort of guy. I hate that. You're taking my dear mind. I don't know why it is you guys are so generous, because you really are being exploited in the service of the old. I think it's by nature, the old should nurture the young. That's what every other species does. That's what human beings used to do. But here we've turned it on its head. Almost every significant political measure in recent years, from running up deficits, who do you think is going to pay them? Not old grandpa in the grave. It'll be, you, our Medicare, our social security, even Obamacare involves differential impact much harder on the young than the old. I find this intolerable morally, although it certainly benefits me. Benefits all of us up here. I exclude you. You're a kid. But one kind of inequality that's rarely talked about is what can justify this massive redistribution, exploitation of the young for the sake of the old. I hope we have a chance to talk more about it later, but don't blame me for being born in the 1940s. I had no say in the matter. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jerry Mueller, and I have the pleasure not only of being here, but of being third, so that I can either, in some cases, expand upon what some of the previous speakers have said, or take issue with them, or at least put what they've said into a somewhat different perspective. And I want to talk a little bit about capitalism and inequality on the normative level, on the level of political philosophy, and I want to talk a little bit about I want to talk a good deal more about capitalism and contemporary inequality in the United States on the empirical level, and to what extent we should be concerned about it. And I want to raise another question that's a very different one, and that is, if we're concerned about something because we think there's a problem, does that mean the problem is soluble? Because it's my contention that there's actually very limited relationship between these two things, and the most radical suggestion I want to make is that to point out that something is a problem does not mean that there is a viable or plausible solution. And it's worth talking about problems and pointing them out analytically, even if you don't have a solution, or even if you think there are good reasons to believe that there is no solution. The notion that one should only raise the possibility of problems because one has a solution is, I think, a great block to analysis and actual understanding of our situation. And I'll also explain why the most commonly given panacea for the problems of economic inequality in the contemporary United States, including the solution given by Professor Lemansky, that is, we have to do something about the educational system, why that is inherently implausible. So let me begin by reviewing a few basic positions in political philosophy about the question of, is inequality bad? Professor Levine alluded to these at the beginning. It's worth mentioning them again. One is, this goes back to a debate that one already finds in the 18th century, say between Voltaire and Rousseau, and one finds it ever since. On the one hand, you have the point of view of Voltaire that economic growth, that the absolute growth of wealth in society is by and large a good thing. First of all, because it's the basis of so much of civilization and culture. It's the basis of our material well-being. It's the basis of our ability to take time away from immediate material needs to think about higher purposes. And on the other hand, you have the position of Rousseau, who suggests that what is really important to people is not how much material well-being they have, it's their status. And status, as Rousseau tells us, is by nature a positional good. That is, you have it in relationship to someone else. You have more of it or less of it. And under that assumption, that what people really care about is not their absolute level of material well-being or the cultural and material comforts that capitalism makes possible, if what they're really concerned about is how much they're making compared to someone else, then it's better to have a poorer society that's more equal than a richer society that is more unequal. And then there are those, and so for those sorts of people, any degree of inequality of wealth is presumptively suspect. And it's similar, any degree of inequality is also suspect to those people who begin with egalitarian premises that all people are fundamentally equal, and the differences in their achievement or differences in their wealth are suspect. That is to say, they must be the result of something having gone wrong in the way in which society or politics are organized. And then, on the other hand, you have people, and I think it's fair to say that Professor Lemansky's in this camp, who begin with the premise that whatever gains the market provides are legitimate. And they're legitimate because either they're the result of unequal talents that people have, or unequal efforts that people make, or simply of luck. And that, from that point of view, more or less any degree of inequality is presumptively all right. And those people might point out that in the quest for status, or what we now call recognition, earning money is only one form of that quest for status or recognition. What about those people who profit through no effort of their own, or through little effort of their own, from the fact that they're born beautiful, something that actually matters a lot in terms of people's status, in terms of their recognition? How about the people who benefit from being born tall? We know that tall people tend to command greater incomes and greater respect than shorter people. What about people who are born smart? For some of these people, money is the great potential equalizer. I may be relatively short, I may be relatively homely, I may be not particularly strong, and perhaps I'm not on the outer right edge of the bell curve for intelligence, but I can even up the odds somewhat by being richer. So that's the other rather extreme position, that any degree of inequality can be legitimated. And then there's a couple of sort of middle positions. One middle position is what I take to be the position of Adam Smith, and that is that any degree of inequality is legitimate if it contributes to the well-being of the vast majority of the population, by and large. And then a somewhat more extreme and egalitarian form of that is the notion that one finds in John Rawls, that inequality is legitimate insofar as it promotes the well-being of those who are worst off in society, which turns out to be actually pretty close to the articulated Catholic position as well. So one reason that we have debates about inequality in the United States and whether it's good or bad is because people differ as to their moral or philosophical premises. So when you see people making analyses of whether it's good or bad, it's important to keep that in mind. Sometimes they're not disagreeing so much about the evidence, they're disagreeing about what really counts in life and what we really ought to be concerned about. Now let me turn from the level of political theory and political philosophy to trying to increase our empirical understanding of what actually has been going on in the United States in terms of increased inequality. Because none of us doubt that there has been an increase in inequality of market rewards in the United States over roughly the last 2 generations, from, say, the early 1970s to the present. There's various ways of computing this, but Professor Lehrman's gone into some of the basic statistics, and so I won't dwell upon them. I want to say a little bit about why that is the case. There are some political reporters and some political partisans who think that this is all the result of politics, not least the ability of the rich to use their riches to influence the political process in such a way that has led to greater inequality. There is an element of truth in that, but it's a small part of the truth compared to larger historical processes that I want to refer to really very briefly, but that are essential for understanding why this increased inequality has come about. And when I talk about increased inequality, like the other speakers, I'm not so much concerned about what tends to get the most attention in polarized political debate, namely how the top 1% are doing, or actually the top 0.01%, and there are people who focus on that. But I think there's this broader trend that Professor Lehrman articulated about the fact that it's not clear exactly what the proportions are, but that the top portion, the top, say, third of the population, is doing better in many respects. The middle third of the population, roughly speaking, has a more or less consistent or stagnant economic state, and the bottom third, certainly in relative terms, is doing worse. Not necessarily in absolute terms, but in terms of the rates at which their income has been increasing. And why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do with big economic and technological and social processes that have been going on in the world, some of which Professor Levine alluded to at the beginning. And that is, first of all, there's the process of technological modernization. The coming in recent generations of greater degrees of automation, of greater use of computers, all of this has meant that our society is increasingly one in which physical strength, the ability to move a lever, the ability to move something from one place to another, matters less and less. And that's partly, as I say, because of automation, partly because of computerization. It's also partly because of what's also been referred to, that is to say, globalization. It's true that there are hundreds of millions of people, especially in Asia, who are much better off now than they were 2 generations ago. And that's partly because they are doing kinds of work that used to be done in the United States, especially less skilled work in the sense of physical work or work that requires a lot of repetitive kinds of labor. And that means that workers in the United States whose main skills or whose main capital has to do with their physical ability to move stuff around, they're increasingly competing with workers from other parts of the world where wages are a lot lower, and therefore their wages have tended to go down, and has already been alluded to, these people whose specialty tended to be in physical labor are typically men. So that brings us to the other inextricably related phenomenon of the last couple of generations, really one of the most important ones in modern history, maybe one of the most important ones in human history, and that is the changes in the capitalist means of production, changes in technology, have led to a situation in which more and more work in advanced industrial societies like ours has to do not with physical labor, but has to do either with analyzing and processing complex information, or it has to do with interpersonal services. the kinds of things we're doing here in this service sector. And it turns out when you look at those sorts of tasks, by and large, men are not better at them than women. By and large, for a variety of reasons, some probably biological, some probably social and cultural, women tend to be at least as good at them as men, and often better. So you've had women, not just women, there's always been women in the workforce, but you have women increasingly participating in the workforce through the course of their lifetimes. Their relative salaries have increased. As you know, there are more women who graduate from universities in the United States than men. There are more women in many professional schools than men, and so on. All of this is bringing about transformations, and if you put that together with another factor that Professor Lehrman alluded to, that is to say that as the economy has become more global, you have markets that are larger and larger. More and more people are involved in that market. It could be the market for something like Facebook that Professor Lemansky talked about. It could be the market for watching NBA games, right, which now extends well beyond the United States. That means that those who are at the top in those fields are part of much larger markets. They're worth, people are willing to pay a lot more to see that NBA player play or to be able to play on Facebook. So you're going to pay the owners of Facebook more, or you're going to pay the managers, or the corporate managers of a company like Facebook more. That's also a factor in leading to increased inequality. Not only that, but for reasons I can't go into here, people's jobs in many respects have become less secure than they were a couple of generations ago, and that has to do with the financialization of the economy. If you want to ask me about that, we can talk about it later. It's also the case that there's probably less social mobility now than there was 3 or 4 generations ago. We shouldn't exaggerate this. The idea of people moving from the bottom quintile to the top quintile was always very much a minority phenomenon, but people did tend to move up from one economic quintile to another in the course of their lifetimes. They still do, but to a lesser degree from generation to generation than in the past, and that's also connected to much broader social trends, which are often focused, as Professor Lehrman alluded to, on the family. Now, what's important to understand is the way in which these other economic and social trends that I've been talking about interact with the family. Because the family is where a great deal of what we call human capital is created. That is to say, those kinds of characteristics and qualities that people have that allow them to prosper or not in the marketplace, and often to prosper or not in life in general. And we have an increasing polarization, or at least diversification, of human capital in American society, in all advanced industrial societies, but probably in American society for a variety of reasons more than most advanced capitalist societies. And that has, when I say human capital, I mean a few things. First of all, people's genetic endowment. People don't like to think about it in American society, but heredity matters in terms of your health, in terms of your intelligence, in all sorts of ways. Secondly, nutrition matters a lot in terms of intergenerational human capital. Depending on what kind of nutrition a woman gets when she's pregnant, depending on what kind of nutrition she gets and provides children with after they're born. And then there are the whole set of cultural characteristics and character traits that are passed on or formed primarily in families. To what extent is curiosity developed in children? To what extent is verbosity developed in children? To what extent is self-control and persistence of effort developed in children? All of these occur primarily in the family. And then there's the whole element of human capital that has to do with actual knowledge of how to get around in society, a good deal of which is also conveyed, not explicitly, but in tacit day-to-day interactions between parents and children. And the amount of human capital being conveyed in families in American society, and as I say, this is to some extent true in most advanced industrial societies, it's more polarized in American society, is becoming ever more divergent. On the one, it turns out, and there's a great deal of social scientific evidence behind this, that there are tremendous advantages to having two parents engaged in a permanent or at least long-term relationship that lasts through the years of child rearing. Advantages in terms of the division of labor, advantages in terms of income, and so on. Not least because of these other factors that I've talked about. We have a growing divergence in American society between those parts of American society, above all the less educated and what used to be called the working class, for men to have less earning capacity, sometimes even less employment capacity, and therefore, for many many women in their potential marriage market, they're seen as not very desirable ongoing mates. And on the other hand, you have this increasing ability of women to earn money, increasingly better than men in many fields. And for those reasons and more, you have this tendency in large parts of American society for people to have children without being married or in some other long-term committed relationship. And that has a lot of effects on their ability to convey human capital from one generation to another. Again, I want to stress that there's an economic cause to this, and there's an economic effect of this. So it's a kind of vicious circle. And all of that is also related, we can go into this later, to this question of incarceration. Incarceration also, the high levels of incarceration in American society also have social and economic causes and effects. One of the reasons that we have so many people locked up is because of perhaps unfair drug laws that Professor Lemansky alluded to. But another reason that we do is because we have a lot of people who are not able to earn a living in the marketplace, who are violent, and who would make lives for most of us a lot less pleasant if they were wandering around on the streets. And that is so there are economic and social causes of that incarceration, and it has economic and social effects. For those communities that have a lot of their menfolk and young menfolk locked up, that makes those menfolk less available for marriage and less desirable as marital partners. So on the one hand, you have declining levels of human capital in the lower reaches of American society. And on the other hand, in the upper reaches, those people who have better educations, those people who have better character traits, sometimes those people who have better luck, do tend to get married in higher amounts than other parts of the population, and their divorce rate has actually gone down over time. And not only that, but those people tend to have two income earners. And not only that, but we know from time allocation studies that those two parents actually tend to devote more time to child rearing than was the case a couple of generations ago. So for all of those reasons, you have increasing levels of inequality in American society. Now, I'll take a last moment to deal with this great panacea of education. Everybody who recognizes this issue of education, this issue of inequality, says the solution is education. Some of them think you have to test teachers more, or you have to privatize the educational system. You have to make college easier to get into. You have to make, but it turns out that it turns out from every study almost that we know that levels of achievement in education, starting with primary school, already vary tremendously by social class and levels of education of the parents. That's because so much of this human capital, this capacity to get educated and get ahead, is, as I say, conveyed in families through genetics, through nutrition, through the kinds of culture and cultivation created in the family. And the notion that we're going to be able to eliminate that or radically reduce it is, I think, a kind of mirage. Even the notion that we're increasingly moving to an American society of taking children away from their parents and putting them in institutional settings for longer and longer periods, I doubt whether it's going to work very well. If you look at the statistics from Head Start, the long-term effects on people's education is pretty minimal. And taking these children away and putting them in institutional settings for long periods of time is also very expensive, and that's probably going to make it less feasible. So for all of those reasons, I think that there are real larger reasons for growing inequality in American society. I just want to say one last thing, and that is sort of the saving grace of all of this. And that is, there's a name for capitalism and democracy when they come together over a long period of time, historically speaking, and that is the welfare state. And one of the things that the welfare state does is it transfers some income from those better off to those less well off, and helps to insulate them from some of the effects of inequality and from the effects of insecurity that are caused by capitalism in general and contemporary capitalism in particular. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks, everyone. I think my job here is a little bit like, you guys probably won't remember this, but in the old comic strip Popeye, there was a character, J. Wellington Wimpy, who used to walk around talking about hamburgers, and has had a great line which was, "Let's you and him fight." So my job here is to try to be that person, to say, let's you and him fight. We'll see if we can strike some sparks here. I'm going to ask one question, and I'll let the panel respond, and then I think we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. Please be ready with a question that has a question mark at the end rather than a period. I guess the question that I want to ask is sparked by Professor Lemaski's comments, but although it's really addressed to everyone on the panel as well. And that's this. As I recall my reading of Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, libertarianism runs into a problem at some point when it confronts the issue of historical injustice. That is to say, injustices that happened in the past that look like they're very difficult to rectify, that if you were starting from ground zero, you might be able to say, complete freedom, competition would lead to okay social results. But if there's historical injustice in the system, then matters get a little bit more complicated. And I wonder, especially in the American context of the American story of race and of America's tangled and dark history. And I wonder, so Professor Lemaski says, prisons are a way that we perpetuate inequality in this country, and schools are a way that we perpetuate inequality, as well as the healthcare system. There is obviously something to that. The fact that those things are there, aren't there grounds based on what Professor Lemaski has said, that would lead one to prefer more redistribution rather than less? Since those things, if we've made the problem as a society, isn't there some obligation to say that we as a society should rectify it? Professor Mueller says the problem is so difficult that we might not be able to do anything about it. It seems to me that there might be different reactions to that. Why not say, well, we ought to do more rather than less, if that's the basic situation? So I'll pose that question to the panel, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
No, I want to hear what you guys say. since I'm the one who provoked the question.
Well, I take a more pragmatic view. What are the things we can do that are efficient? As Professor Lemaski pointed out, the health system has been eating up a huge chunk of our dollars. We're now spending massive amounts in the welfare state on health care. If we were able to even take 20 to 25% of it and use that as help in terms of income growth for low-income people, it would have a massive effect. So I think, we have this health problem. I am not going to try to resolve that in a short set of comments. I would like to say that I think we have emphasized the wrong thing in terms of mobility. I would disagree with Professor Mueller here a bit in that all of the skills, he wasn't saying this, but let me characterize him saying it, all of the skills for jobs are becoming either academic or entertainment or some services, he mentioned, interpersonal services. And there's truth in terms of the broad trend, but in terms of the kinds of jobs, there are many, many still what many of us call middle-skilled jobs. And those jobs can be done well or they can be done poorly. They can be done with high productivity or low productivity. What we've been doing in the area of education is put all our eggs in what I call the academic-only basket. And what that has done is it has crowded out efforts to teach both occupational skills and what some people call employability skills, soft skills. These skills are very important in the real world, especially in the bottom half of the distribution, maybe the bottom 2/3 of the distribution. And we all know that these are important. But yet, we don't do much about it. All we do is measure academic skills, test scores, that sort of thing. We don't measure lots of other types of skills. And my view is that a very good way of attaining those skills is through initiatives like apprenticeship, which involve learning at work sites, and that gives you a lot of experience in interacting with adults and in dealing with real-world problems, along with learning occupational skills. Other countries have that, Switzerland, for example, which is a very market-driven economy more broadly. It has, everyone can own a gun there. In fact, they're almost legally mandated to have a gun. And yet, they have probably the lowest unemployment rate, the lowest youth unemployment rate, and they only have about 20 to 25% of people going through university. And they're 15% richer than we are. So I think it's not at all clear that I agree with much of what Professor Mueller said about early upbringing and so on, but I do not agree that you can't do anything about it. Finally, just a couple of points on the welfare state. I view my career as been trying to make the welfare state more efficient and do things that, on the one hand, benefit broad groups of people, but on the other hand, are economically sound. And there, I think we do have a long way to go. In the housing area is one big area where we have a really weird set of programs. And we ought to do that a lot better. I think we're spending the scale of spending is adequate. It's just how we're doing it is not.
Let me just say briefly that on the main issue that Professor Lehrman has raised about significance of vocational training, I'm afraid that we find ourselves in radical agreement. That is to say, I think it's true it's an important thing to say. You know what? It's an important thing to say that not everybody should go to college. Not everybody has the intellectual capacity, or not everybody has the kinds of character traits or the kinds of interest that fit them for college. Indeed, there's a lot of people in college in the United States, and I don't mean the people sitting here, who arguably shouldn't be in college. And one of the reasons that they are in college is because everybody tells them that you have to go to college. We should also admit that there are plenty of people in the United States who actually can't complete high school. I mean, they can get a high school leaving certificate, but they don't actually have the capacities, or it's highly unlikely that high schools could cultivate in them the capacities to pass 12th grade English or 12th grade algebra. The question is, what are those people going to do? And as Professor Lehrman quite properly points out, vocational training in this country is far behind that of many other societies. Now, that doesn't mean that we can just import what they do in other societies, because one of the reasons that those other societies have different systems of vocational training is because they're different sorts of societies. But it is an area in which perhaps there's the most room for improvement and necessity of improvement in American society. The goal of making the welfare state more effective and efficient is something that I think every thoughtful person of almost any political persuasion, short of libertarians, ought to spend a good deal of time thinking about.
Oh, real nice. Thank you. All right, the gloves are off here. Look, like my colleagues, I agree that there's something wrong with our educational system. We're a rich country. Why can't we spend at least as much per student as high-achieving countries like Finland, like Germany, like South Korea do? Why can't we pay our primary teachers as much or more than these countries do? Oh, wait, we do. We spend more on our public education than any of them, I believe, without exception. And yet, our results are pretty dismal. I think scandalously dismal. If I had my way here, I would, utter the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it's really, really broke, throw it out and try something else. I would put the money that's now spent on our underperforming schools on the kids themselves, so through their parents, that they will then be able to engage on a voluntary basis with willing providers for academic instruction, vocational instruction, or what have you. Of course, this is a kind of libertarian idea, so you can dismiss it as such, but what's the alternative? Let me just say one other thing about our educational system and the product of it. I think Professor Levine mentioned when he started that unemployment, and especially youth unemployment in America, is terribly low. Right? So you guys should feel miffed about it. I want to suggest you feel good about it. Why? Because youth employment in the United States, as bad as it is spectacularly better than it is in France, in Italy, in Spain, in the great welfare states of the European Union. This is a civilization that really knows how to mistreat its young. You guys, you get screwed over, but not quite as bad. So, that's something to take into the weekend to make you feel good. Look, I think I've talked enough now. I'd be really interested to hear what the products of our public schools have to say.
So we'll take questions. We have microphones set up on either side of the room. So now's your chance to come. Hopefully we've said something that has sparked your fancy, provoked you. You see that we've got people lining up.
A lot of action.
We'll go back and forth between the two sides. Hopefully we'll have enough time to get all the questions in. Remember to make them short and with a question at the end.
Are the ones on the right libertarian?
Well, it's not clear from which side.
All right.
So we're a little bit backwards. But Matteo here first.
Yeah, hi. This is probably more an economist type question. I mean, one thing that's been said as a potential solution for income inequality, and I'm pretty sure has been tested and already failed, but the whole issue of minimum wage raises that comes up all the time, as I'm sure many of you who think it would probably not be such a good idea. I mean, is that something that if it weren't as drastic as, say, the $9 and whatever President Obama proposed, is there any sort of, is that something that is maybe removing minimum wage? Is that something that you think potentially could have an effect on inequality in this country?
Professor Lerman's suggesting that we take a few questions at the same time. So why don't we take one more and then we'll...
Absolutely. My question is, I guess to gauge it more in terms of the current economic system and what's kind of going on with the sequester, where should we be going in terms of our societal system? Should we be going towards creating a whole different system, as kind of alluded previously, keeping this or reforming the status quo towards a system with more or less inequality?
Should we take those two?
What system did you say?
He didn't.
Our American system, the system
Oh, the American society in general.
Shall we take quick answers to those two and then?
Just on the minimum wage, actually, if you look at the gap in wage rates, let me just ask a question. What do you think is the ratio of the wage rate of the 90th percentile person in the country, not worker, full-time worker, versus the 10th percentile? I mean, is it double? Is it 5 times? Is it 10 times?
10,000.
What do people think? How about 6 times? More or less? More than 6 times?
More.
More. How many more? How many less? Is it 8 times? More? More than 8 times?
More than 8 times.
How many more than 8 times? The answer is it's 4.35 or 4.3.
Is that just cash income or does
No,
it
that's the wage rate.
the wage?
Wage rate, hourly wage rate. So a much bigger gap in incomes than there is in the hourly wage rate, which is telling you that it's not all about the workforce. With regard to the minimum wage, the problem is that the income earner and the family unit are 2 different things. So someone who's living in a low-cost area and only working for himself or herself, you know, $8 an hour may be okay. Somebody living in a particularly high-cost area with several children, it's harder. That's why we have the Earned Income Tax Credit, which gives you, if you have 2 kids, a 40% subsidy up to a certain level. Now, so the big issue, though, is getting the job at all. And that's why I think, you know, it might help a little bit, but there are some negative side effects. And one of the biggest side effects, I think, is the notion that somehow we can mandate it. I mean, if we can mandate 9, why not 12? Why not 40? And it gives people an awkward notion of what it means to be productive.
I'm one of the few libertarians who kind of likes minimum wage law. And the reason I like it is it gives all these generous people a chance to get it off their chest and make speeches about how they love the poor. And at $9, doesn't do much harm. Sure, it does some harm. Some people become unemployed thanks to your wanting to help them. But compared to so much else that's done in this country, the harm is minimal. Talk about Medicare. Harm is massive. Talk about, well, don't get me started. Oh, wait, I am started. I'm going to stop.
Jerry, would you like to take a shot at the, is more inequality good or bad? I think that was the question, the second question that came.
Well, nobody knows an entirely alternative system. I don't know. I mean, we know of entirely alternative systems. They just haven't worked out very well. There are many varieties of capitalism in the world. There are all sorts of changes that could be made, all sorts of alterations that could be made to our society, to everything from, copyright and patent changes, which actually could have some very positive effects because they're too stringent now, to changes in some of the structures of the welfare state. But I don't think anybody. So there's lots of room for tinkering, and even fairly substantial tinkering. I don't know that anybody knows a radically different system that works better. And I don't really think it's very. Honestly, I don't think it's very useful to think about, to use those sorts of criteria. What would we see that there are problems in our system. That doesn't mean that there's some radically different alternative that would eliminate these problems or that would not create greater problems. So, yes, lots of room for alteration, not for radical replacement. And on the minimum wage, for the reasons that have been articulated, I'm somewhat agnostic.
Okay, let's get a question over here. Jay.
All right. So my question is for Professor Lemansky. You claimed that the young subsidizing the old was an immoral system, and my question is, is it really? Because we have all manner of laws that discriminate or differentially treat based on age, often on sort of an arbitrary but a necessary boundary, like with a driver's license at age 16. It's not that 15-year-olds can't drive, it's just that we don't want 5-year-olds driving. Same with age of consent, drinking age, voting, so on. And so my question is it really immoral for the young to subsidize the old? Because with age discrimination, unlike other forms of discrimination, you can grow out of being young. And eventually, rather than being a form of discrimination, it's sort of a social contract that if you make it to old age, you are then subsidized as well. So is that really an immoral system if the people who are paying for it at one point eventually benefit from it?
Now, I should agree with you, because then you guys will like us old people more. But in fact, first, it isn't just subsidizing, but it's involuntary subsidization. If you want to give me money toward my next walker, God bless you. But you're required to do so. And I will tell you this, and you guys know this, this is what you say in surveys. You don't believe that when you hit later years that anything like the kind of transfer that's going on to my generation will take place with you. And they're right. But the sort of subsidization is not a trivial thing. We have now done a sequester here. It's pretty bad. The whole idea, make this sequester a bad enough thing that even politicians will know they have to do otherwise. I think you would have to threaten to nuke the Capitol before politicians think it's bad enough to do something different. Maybe that's not the worst idea. But what is off the table with regard to this are what's called entitlements. And what these entitlements are over a little bit to the poor. In terms of Medicaid, I wouldn't advise you to go on Medicaid. You wouldn't like it so much. but it's mostly transgenerational things of this. We've never done before. No country has done before and done well. That Europe is a little ahead of us in doing this, and so we get the salutary examples of places like Spain and France. And I don't think you really want to go there. In terms of other kinds of things, I think it's outrageous that in the U.S., 18-year-olds are not allowed to buy a drink. But my own students tell me that they've discovered a technology to get around that. And if it isn't known at American University, come visit UVA and ask them to share their ID technology with you. It'll make your life go better.
Just a short follow-up.
On
if
that
I may.
law-abiding note, let's get some more questions in here.
Okay.
Mike.
It seems that there's a pretty cavernous disparity in the panelists' different understandings of the type of capitalism at play in generating these disparities, these inequalities. My question is particularly directed at Professor Lemaski. It seems it would be fair to assume that you assume a type of choice-based free market capitalism. My question is, in face of the kind of automation that Professor Muller has described and its effects in creating a surplus army of labor, and the incarceration of based along class lines, it seems that there's an increasing concentration of wealth that would in turn seem to indicate a development of a monopoly capitalism rather than a free market capitalism. Is that a fair distinction, and in what way does that inform your understanding of markets and choice?
Let's take a couple more questions.
My question is this. The discussion today seems to be a lot about the causes of inequality. And my question is, back maybe to the youth and age question, a lot of that seems to do more with political capital, not just human capital. Well, if I call up my senator tomorrow, chances of me getting a meeting, not very good. I give him, $250,000 to a PAC. I can probably maybe get a meal with him. My question is this. Will our system survive something? My understanding is one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world at the moment. Citigroup wrote that it looks something like 16th century Spain. This is like 4 years ago. So my question is that good for America? Can our political institutions work efficiently if people feel disenfranchised from the very beginning? And does inequality, or should they be concerned with that in light of current inequality?
Right. Good question. Yes.
Okay. Professor Lemaski had a standard that I liked for identifying inequality that we might consider bad, and that's whether inequality was imposed. And I was curious in the context of these early childhood investments that came up, whether Professor Lemaski would consider that imposed on the children since they didn't voluntarily transact to be in that position, and how does that affect our thinking about how to deal with it?
Okay, we're going to go for one more if you guys can remember all these questions.
My question actually has to do with one of the aspects that you guys identified as the base of inequality, and that has to do with the school system. Professor Lemansky, you called for the dissolution of the public school system, but couldn't we say that the public school system has recently been hindered by private and charter schools? And instead of implementing privatization in the school system, shouldn't we then defer some of that capital into the public school system? And then on the note of vocational schools, if we have a majority go to vocational schools, aren't we eventually hindering our own innovation because most of the new ideas and new ways to do things and formulated thoughts come out of universities and colleges and less out of technical aspects on day-to-day hands-on?
Okay, 3 questions. Shall we
Oh,
take
we're
them?
supposed to answer now?
Yeah, shall we?
Well, 2 were in May, so let me, do we have a surplus army of labor? In some ways we do, in that we've got this unemployment issue because of all sorts of impediments to, especially again to the young, for getting jobs. This would explain why people from all over the world refuse to come to America to work, because there's a glut of, oh wait, they don't. We are a magnet for people who want to work to invest and make a living. That tells us something. What does it tell us? Don't have time to talk about that now. In terms of imposing on children, you know, of course you're right. We do impose on children things like, you know, I used to tell my kid, you got to go to school, even though there were cartoons on television. You know, I think it's not a terrible thing to treat children like children. I think it's not a terrible thing for old people to support children, to subsidize them. When it gets turned in reverse, I find that pretty unsafe. I'll let you guys take the rest.
Jerry, do you want to take the political question?
Not really, because on the one hand, I think that unequal political access does play a role in our society, but it's important to remember that we are talking about a democracy. And in a democracy, everybody's vote counts. And I'm not just speaking in theory here. There are a lot of very rich people who put a lot of their own money into the most recent election. The candidate that they tended disproportionately to favor, you may notice, lost. And one of the reasons that he lost was because the kinds of policies that he was advocating were seen by a majority of the American population as less desirable than the kinds of policies, somewhat more egalitarian policies, that the other candidate, namely President Obama, was offering. Now, however you feel about what the decision ought to have been, and on that, for these purposes, I remain agnostic, it's important to note that there's lots of things that money can't buy in our society. It can influence it disproportionately, but ultimately there are countervailing effects in a democracy, possibly for good or bad. You know, there are democracies like some of the ones in Southern Europe that Professor Lemansky has alluded to, where the effects of this have been rather deleterious in terms of the prospects of long-term economic growth. However, that's the case. So I think there's a tendency, especially in Washington and especially among political reporters, look, that's what political reporters do, is they report on people's attempts to influence politics, not least through money. There's a tendency then to lose sight of the larger factors, both leading to increased inequality and tending to alleviate it to some degree through democratic welfare state processes.
Okay. I think we had one question on the schools. Does
Well,
anyone want to say
I
very
just want to
short?
say one very short thing about training. First of all, I don't advocate doing it mainly through schooling. I advocate doing it through a combination of workplace training specified as to what skills the individual will learn in the workplace along with some schooling. Second, if you look at those countries that are very good at that type of training, and I don't mean large numbers of vocational schools, you see that they have very high rates of innovation and very high rates of high-level manufacturing, for example. So, I mean, I'd be happy to talk about it later, but I think that's
Great. Okay, we've got 4 questions. Let's go quick, and we'll get quick answers, starting over here.
Hi, I just had a quick question for all of you regarding gender inequalities. Most of you touched upon the inequalities between men and women today, like income inequalities or the achievement or educational gap. So my question to all of you is, does this help to explain the absence of women on today's panel or the conference in general? Thank you.
I don't think we have a good answer to that question, except that we asked and they said no. So, but we appreciate the question.
Do we go to that side or?
Yeah, let's.
Okay. My question is about women in the workplace as well. As more women go to college and more women become educated and start to go into the workplace, that puts a social change on marriage expectation. And I think 2 of you touched upon how disruption in marriage and single families creates inequality. So as more women become involved in this, there is maybe not that expectation of them to get married and have a family so soon, or even they don't want one. So how does that change society, and how does that put equality, or maybe they don't want to get married but they want to have a child anyway. So I'm saying I think it's more of a social change, and as women get more educated, they're not as reliant on that family that they don't want anymore, maybe.
For the philosophers on the panel, what would be society's role in terms of helping those who, as a product of public education, those friends of mine who don't have the two parents, don't have the parents probably get $10,000 a year, who don't have the resources necessary to go on to college? What would be society's role in order to help alleviate that and give them a good chance at a good life?
My question is very closely related to what you asked. I was just wondering, Professor Lerman, you did mention that having healthy marriages and reducing non-marital fertility as one of the ways of impacting inequality. What sort of role do you see for public policy to, develop programs or develop incentives inbuilt to promote those kind of healthy relationships? Thanks.
Well, let me take the two family structure questions quickly. First, I think we need to recognize their importance, and I think across the political spectrum there's a growing concern about this issue. And it relates to Daniel's question about kids growing up and so on, types of families they grow up in. I think one of the things that sort of began the very first elements of it many years ago and then was pushed in a little bit in the Bush administration was an effort to increase healthy marriages, healthy relationships, couple relationships. There were actually some major demonstrations to try to help couples learn the skills to succeed in a good relationship. Most of the, at least what we think we know about people deciding to marry or not to marry is that they would like to marry. I'm even talking about people who have children before they marry. In fact, they even expect to marry, but things kind of break down. And some of it's social and some of it's economic. But again, by focusing only on sort of academic skills and intellectual skills, we miss these other skills that are quite important. I remember meeting a woman who spoke to a group of, I think, at a women's college, undergraduates, and she talked to them about relationships and how you deal with someone from the opposite sex usually. And they had never been really exposed to those kinds of questions. So that's one thing. But a second thing is to improve the outcomes, and this goes to the question about what do you do about people who grow up in a low-income family and so on. I don't say that they shouldn't go to college. If they do well and they aspire and they are really interested, and I think college subsidies to low-income people are quite appropriate. What I do say is that we shouldn't impose one system to try to help people gain rewarding careers. There are other systems we know work in other parts of the world, and even in this country to some extent, that could be greatly broadened. And if that were done, I think we would have more efficiency, we'd have a better set of opportunities for people, and we would also improve the structuring of families.
Okay. Last words from...
Can I take up the gender? I think that's maybe the most interesting question raised. I'm especially interested because all my life I've got invitations to do things addressed to Ms. Lauren Lemaski, It's only when they see me that they realize they may have misestimated. You were almost right with what you said about no women up here, except maybe you came a little late. The one who introduced all of it was the dean of the whole place, and her time is obviously much more valuable than mere philosophers, academics. And so, does that mean anything? What I think it means is, look, if I were a betting man, I would bet that the 21st century, maybe beyond, is going to be one in which women more and more outstrip men in terms of their performance. I don't think that we know anything about how to prevent this, how to bring males up to female performance level, and I'm not sure it's a bad thing. You know, men have had a pretty damn good 25 centuries. Maybe the next 25, not so good. But we'll have to speculate on that.
Great, okay. After speculation, we'll be back here at 1 o'clock for the next panel promptly. Thanks, see you then.